Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about how to not take the name in vain. This is a pretty broad topic. It's going to include even some fancy graphics and grammar and stuff like that. And so it begins, though, with the history of the Hebrew language. And you'll notice that I didn't say the ancient history of the Hebrew language because what we have to deal with today is not an ancient problem, it's a modern problem. Because until 1881, Hebrew was a dead language, almost completely extinguished. It was reserved for just rabbis and people in the yeshiva to read Torah scrolls. And when Jews went about their day, they did it in other languages. Even if they went back to the Promised Land, which was called Palestine at the time, they would speak Yiddish or French or Russian, and then maybe if they all got together and realized that they knew some Hebrew, they might speak some Hebrew, but it wasn't correct and it wasn't standardized. Um, the language died on purpose. When the Romans sacked Jerusalem in AD 70, they were attempting to destroy that culture that wouldn't accept idolatry, and that culture includes Messianic believers as well, as we benefited from from the preservation of the Torah and the Torah readings as well. So those dedicated to the Torah made the conscious decision to preserve it the best that they could. Some families kept it going, and so when Ben Yehuda, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, is the guy who is who credited for bringing the language back from extinction, and it was his mission to do so. And he did it as a secular Jew. He didn't do it necessarily for religious purposes, but heavily on the nationalist front. He saw that Italy and Greece had got their countries and their language back, and he wanted the same thing for his countrymen. He wanted to start reestablishing Israel as a country and with Hebrew as its language. And he took some pretty big steps in order to get this done. He learned how to speak it. He brought it back orally. It was never lost as far as reading it, but it was lost as far as speaking it. That's going to become very important and very clear here in a little while. This is important information. And he forced his kids to only speak Hebrew because he didn't want them to be tempted to get in the comfort of the languages of their peers as he was raising his family in Jerusalem. He left Europe and went to Palestine, what they called it at the time. He was shunned by the rabbis. They wanted to keep Hebrew like the Catholics keep Latin. They wanted to keep the Holy Tongue for themselves, and they will tell you what it means. And they excommunicated him at one point, the Orthodox did, because he wanted to bring it back for everybody. And they said, no, 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 you only do that on God's timing. You don't do that on your timing. But obviously God works through people. And so this gentleman is the guy who brought spoken Hebrew back into play, to where in 1922 the British ruled that it was the language of Palestine. It was an accepted language in 1922 because of the efforts of Eliezer ben Yehuda. And the reason I bring this up is because this guy, this determined fellow, was a scholar, and he wanted to bring the language back, and he pronounced the name Yahweh as Yahweh. And he's the guy who did that. But he didn't bring that back. He brought that out of the yeshiva. So that was how the name was preserved by the people who hold that name in the highest of esteem. So, well, equal to those of us Messianic believers, I suppose. So he's, it wasn't a debate about how to pronounce the name, and they have a lot of, traditions about why they don't pronounce the name. But just understand that when we, pick how we're going to pronounce this name, it's important to understand where it came from. And when it comes down to, listening to 21st century, internet preachers to explain how Hebrew really is supposed to work, or listening to the guy who brought Hebrew back from the dead, my default position is going to be to listen to the guy who brought Hebrew back from the dead and restored it as a language, which we can benefit greatly of today. And the moral of the story here is that the Hebrew was almost completely dead at the end of the 19th century, and it was brought back to life. Now, let's look at some other very plain information as to why we don't say other things. Okay, so here is the Brown Driver Briggs, one of the most authoritative dictionaries in English or resources to tell us about all the words of the Bible is the BDB, or Brown Driver Briggs, concordance dictionary, whatever you want to call it. And it says that YHVH is not pronounced except with the vowel points of the word Adonai. So Adonai is not grammatically related to the word YHVH at all. Now, Yahweh is sometimes called Adonai in the scripture. See, that's another fallacy of our movement, is that we should never call him Lord, because he's never called Lord in the Bible. It's not true. Adonai means my Lord. Adon means Lord. Adonai means my Lord, AI at the end of it. And he is called Adonai, and so are others. It is calling someone Adonai is a term of respect, of high respect, like your honor, or sir, or your majesty, or things like that. So it's a term of respect, and sometimes Yahweh is called Adonai. Now the Jewish people did decide that they were going to stop pronouncing Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh other than in very holy circumstances. They didn't. When we say stop pronouncing it, it doesn't mean that they just stopped it completely. I'm sure some people kept going, as Eliezer ben Yehuda, brought it back. But he probably would never say the name out loud himself because of his traditions and whatever. But here this points out that the pronunciation of Yehovah, right, is not how the word is supposed to be pronounced. It's very plain as day that they took the vowel points from the word Adonai and plopped it down under Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Now, the people who did that are called the Masoretes, and the Masoretic text is the most authoritative Hebrew Torah in existence. Those are the people who decided to put the vowel points down to tell you how to pronounce words. And it's very widely, almost universally accepted that they put the vowel points down under Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh for Adonai to remind people not to actually read Yahweh, so that they wouldn't accidentally pronounce the name. And it's right here on the Brown Driver Briggs. It says this. This is, authoritative. So I don't know why we would ever break from that. And there's a reason why those vowel points don't work, because of what Yahweh's name actually means, which we're going to get to in a slide or two. Hebrew is not written with vowels. The vowel points were put in because the language was dying or dead. The Masoretic text is only really about 1,000 years old, maybe 1,200 years old. It does not. There isn't a written Torah that goes back, maybe the oldest one is from 800 AD and it's in fragments and stuff like that. And the ones that are that old don't have vowel points because Hebrew doesn't need vowel points. It was a language that was meant to be taught orally. It was meant to be passed down through voice, by teaching. And so you learn how the words are pronounced, even though they're only written with consonants, by memory and by rote and by understanding the arrangement of the letters. Now, I'm talking about this like I can speak Hebrew. My Hebrew would be, grade school level, but this is from studies. I'm studying, written word and history and stuff like that, and I have taken classes online to learn Hebrew grammar. So if you look at Haaretz, they're the Hebrew, the most widely circulated Jewish newspaper today, there aren't any vowel points on the screen. All right, there's just the consonant block letters without those little dashes and dots underneath, because they don't need them, because they know how to pronounce the words. And so that's the goal here, is to show you that these vowel points had to be put in because the language had ceased to be spoken and they needed to invent a way to remind themselves how to speak it. And along the way, when they got to the tetragrammaton, which is what YHVH is called sometimes, when they got to that, they put in the vowel points for Adonai. This is not, I mean, to dispute this is just to try to get web hits. This isn't like something that's even remotely disputable, but we see it disputed all the time, which kind of makes you shake your head. I mean, why do we spend so much time on that? So the contrast here is the English language, which we have A, E, I, O, U. We have vowels and we have sounds. You still need to have some oral teaching to know that or I can be I or I, and the letter Y can do just about whatever. But you do have to have some oral stuff, but not much, because we have separate vowels to separate out our consonants. Same with Latin, same with Greek, same with Spanish. So those languages are easier to learn how to read and how to speak because they have rules that are widely available to see. But Hebrew doesn't have those vowels in there. And so if you look at the older script, and if somebody claims, oh, we found this really ancient script of Hebrew and it tells me how to pronounce Yahweh, it doesn't do that. It doesn't do it because the vowel points are as old as they are. They aren't first century vowel points. They aren't King David's vowel points. So when you look at Hebrew, the script that we look at today is called the Ashuri script, which means the alphabet, the letters are shaped in a way that was dated to about the days of the Babylonian captivity, and so that's the most popular, most common form of Hebrew is the Ashuri script, which is the Assyrian script, is what that is. The Ivri script is the one that is often called Paleo Hebrew, and it's not Paleo Hebrew, it's the Ivri script. It's the time between the letters were pictures, and then before they became the shapes that they are today is Ivri, and that Ivri means Hebrew in Hebrew. So it's the Hebrew script, and it's how they wrote it. This is when the yod looks like a kind of like the number 7 with an extra prong coming off of it. That's the Ivri script. And then you have the pictograms. But the pictograms in the Ivri script, they don't have the vowel points. They don't have vowels. So the pictograms are just representing how you make a sound. The picture itself didn't actually tell a story. It was just representations of sounds, which then turned into the Ivri alphabet, which then turned into the Ashuri alphabet over time. And then in the 800s, 900s AD, they started to get these vowel points put into it. So it's not when somebody says here, you can see how to pronounce the word from this other representation of YHVH. You can't. It's still the vowel points still aren't there. So this brings me to another point here. Okay. If my slides will advance. I wonder why it will go. So here in this slide is Jeremiah 16:21. This is the part where it talks about the restoration, when bringing people back to the land. Not a second Exodus. It's talking about a restoration of people who already know who they are. And it says, therefore, behold, I'm going to make them know. This time I will make them know my power and my might, and they shall know that my name is Yahweh. I just want to be clear here that the prophet Jeremiah knew how to pronounce the name Yahweh. That they all knew how to pronounce the name Yahweh. At that point, I do not believe that they had already adopted the practice of swapping out Adonai, but we could take it to the bank that Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the big 3 major prophets there, they most assuredly knew how to pronounce the name. This isn't talking about pronunciation at all. It's talking about the great restoration when Yahweh will call his people back to Jerusalem. This actually happened with Nehemiah and Ezra as a microcosm of the fullest one when King Cyrus restored Judea. This is going to happen on an enormous scale when Yeshua, the Son of Yahweh, comes back and returns all his people gathered from everywhere, even from the graves. That's what the timing for the ultimate fulfillment of this is at the second coming when Yeshua comes and the dead in Messiah rise first, and then the people who are gathered everywhere around the world are just brought to Jerusalem to start off the millennial times. And that's what the Great Restoration is going to happen. And the reason that people will know the name of Yahweh isn't because of grammar. Yeshua is not coming back with an enormous bullhorn to say, no, this is how you pronounce it. I mean, he's probably going to tell us how to pronounce it, and it's what we're doing today is probably slightly wrong at least. But the purpose of this is saying that I'm going to make them know, this time I will make them know my power, my might, and they shall know my name is Yahweh. They shall know, as we're going to get into here in a second, that his name is eternal, that his being is eternal, that he is all-powerful. When you see this humongous restoration of billions of people being resurrected and sent to Jerusalem, the God, the Elohim that does that is going to be known as the ultimate power in the universe at that point. That's what this is actually getting to. It's not about grammar. And if we think about the Exodus, that's what was happening at that time too. Yahweh was demonstrating his power by humiliating the false gods of the Egyptians. And he was showing his power by delivering 2 million people to Mount Sinai, and destroying the Egyptian army without a carnal war by drowning them in an ocean. That's him displaying his awesome power, his awesome might, and that's when the Egyptians finally knew, hey, wait a minute, that is the real Elohim right there. So, let's start looking at the grammar though here. Let's start looking at the grammar and how to know what his name really means, because that's the ultimate reason for learning to pronounce a word, is to learn what it actually means. And we start that by looking at a scripture that doesn't actually contain the name. In Exodus 3:14, Elohim said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Here's the problem, and this is where a lot of confusion sets in, is because it doesn't actually say I am has sent me to you. That is what the King James translators and subsequent translators have used to represent a concept, because Yahweh is self-existent. He just exists. He's just a being that transcends time, that transcends any type of understanding. He has no width, no depth, no height, he's all encompassing, all eternal. And so what this actually says is Haya Asher Haya is I am who I am. Haya means self-existent or I exist. Haya Asher Haya means exist that exists. That he's saying that the eternal being is what's sending you. So it doesn't literally say I am. It kind of says I am. Because if you were just going to make a representation of what does it mean to be this eternal, all-powerful, all-consuming creator of the universe, they decided to represent that as I am, right? The great I am, meaning that he has no past, he has no future, he just is, and he exists in all points in time at all the time. So in Hebrew, if you were to say I am, you would say ani, A-N-I. And that means, are you Chris? Ani. That means I am, right? So that's not here. You can see that ani is not actually here. And when it switches to Greek, they do put the representation for the letter I in there because that's how Greek works. Greek works like English does. And we're going to get to that here in a second. But what it means here is to say he's the self-existent one, or the one that exists. It figuratively says, I am. Yahweh is literally I am because time is meaningless to him. He's not temporal or corporeal. But to understand what they're trying to get at here, let's just prove this out. And the reason for me putting Ayer, Haya, Asher, Haya in here is because that is part of his name. His name Yahweh, see the YAH carries over. The name Yahweh actually means self-existent one. So here he's actually introducing himself to Moses, and he's telling Moses who he is without actually telling him his name, but he's using parts of his name. So if we look at the Septuagint, though, to really slam this one home, in the Septuagint, which I'm showing you the Apostles' Bible here, which has the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation in Greek, but Genesis to Malachi in Greek was made by Jews about 120 years before Yeshua, called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is very most likely the Bible of first century Christians because it's in Greek and everybody spoke Greek. The word synagogue is Greek. And as I'm reading Philo of Alexandria now, he understood the Bible in Greek as a Jewish philosopher. And so it's not blasphemous, it's not wrong to say that the Greek was the language of the world back then, because it was. And Yahweh used that language to spread the gospel. He didn't spread the gospel in Hebrew because the Greek-speaking world would not have actually understood that. So the reason this is up on the board, though, is because in about 120, 150 years before Yeshua, there was a command to make a Torah in Greek. So that for many reasons. One is so that there could be a copy of it in the Greek library at Alexandria, and also so that Jews could read the Bible for themselves, because they were largely Greek speakers at that time, particularly outside of the land. So and when the Bible translators, the rabbis, took this scripture, Exodus 3:14, and translated it into Greek, they came up with the word emi, meaning self-existence, means I exist, the being, right? And so it says here, and God spoke to Moses, saying, I am the being. And he said, thus ye shall say to the children of Israel, the being has sent me to you. So this really slams home the concept that Yahweh's name centers around eternity. And so the being has sent him. On the screen is a picture for the word the being, which means exist. The rabbis who translated from Hebrew to Greek, they did insert I am because Greek language works like English and it needs that to actually make sense to the reader. It says I am the being. But what it's saying is I am a self-existent one. And this is how they chose to represent it. And so you can see that the word for being means self-existent one. So now we're going to move on now, after 2 pages of notes, going to move on to actually taking the name in vain and picking apart this commandment, because it's pretty important. It's the 3rd commandment. And we need to make sure we know what we're talking about when trying to not take the name in vain. And we do know that pronouncing it properly, or as close to properly as you can get, is not taking it in vain. That was something that the Jewish rabbis decided to put a hedge around the name and say that you can't pronounce it, so that way nobody would ever blaspheme the name. Well, that's not what it means. They kind of missed the boat on that one. And I've been particular about how to pronounce it today, but let's be crystal clear on this pronunciation thing. We are supposed to be able to pronounce it. When I was just talking about the Exodus, when the 2 million people got across the Red Sea and landed at the foot of Mount Sinai, it was a mixed multitude, and the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, opens up with Yahweh actually introducing himself to the people, and he tells everybody his name, and they all heard his name, from the smallest child to the oldest person, from the pauper to the prince, from the elders to the commoners. Every tribe, every tongue, everybody present at Mount Sinai heard him introduce himself, and he meant for them to know his name. He meant for them to be able to pronounce his name. And pronouncing the name is not what terrified them. What terrified them was his incredible power. The fact that he could part a sea, and that he had this booming voice. The voice comes as the sound of many waters, as the sound of many trumpets. It wasn't just a big, deep, rumbling voice coming out of the mountain. It was some cataclysmic event, and it terrified them to be in that proximity with this eternal being that could snuff them out at any given moment. So with that being said, let's look at the commandment here. Is Exodus 27, you shall not take the name Shem of Yahweh your Elohim in vain, for Yahweh will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. So we read the commandments, and we read them as a list, because they are a list, and they are the 10 commandments. So we read each one, and we almost, I will tell you personally, I almost exclusively read them as a list of standalone concepts. But what if we read this in context? What if we just started with the first commandment and got all the way through the third commandment, maybe even carry over to the fourth commandment, and we learn what he's talking about when he says, he gives them his name, and then he tells them he's the one that brought them out of Egypt. So he's saying, I am the mighty one, the Elohim, that destroyed the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian empire, and I brought you over here. I'm it. I'm the ultimate authority. Nobody's more powerful than me. And you will not worship idols or anything you made or any false gods. You will not have any gods in my presence. So he's telling them how to worship him and how not to worship him. And then he says, you shall not take his name in vain. I don't think it's a stretch here to say that idolatry and false god worship is how you take the name in vain. It's a component of it. It's not the only way of taking the name in vain. Don't get me wrong. Some people tend to say, Chris just said this one thing, and that's that. There are many ways of taking the name in vain, but I think that looking at it in context is probably the first step towards understanding. And he tells everybody he's jealous. He's not going to tolerate any other gods, and he's not going to tolerate any idols. And then he says not to take the name in vain. They're Israel. They bear his name. So he's telling them that your behavior, your obedience to this Torah, these mitzvot that I'm giving, are going to identify you as my people, which means it identifies his people by their behaviors, by their actions, by what they do. The commandment for the Sabbath tells them a behavior to identify themselves as his people. Today we keep the seventh day Sabbath. We keep the fourth commandment today. And immediately people go, what are you, Jewish? No, we're not Jewish. But you understand that knee-jerk reaction is that people are identifying the Sabbath with Jewish people, which means they're identifying it with Yahweh, the God who gave the Torah. And so that's how we keep his name holy. We don't take it in vain by doing what he told us to do and not doing what he told us not to do. So what if taking his name isn't really about pronunciation? The heart of the commandment is deeds. The heart of the commandment is actions. It's how your works display your faith. And so to get deeper into this, the reason I have the word Shem up there is the word Shem means name, like an identifying label. That's sure enough, like you typed in your Brother P-Touch and hit print and put a name on somebody. My name is Christopher. My wife's name is Diana. That's a label to where you can identify a person. But more deeply, the word Shem means a person's character and reputation. In societies that have honor and shame, which God's society absolutely has that, having a good name means that you have a lot of honor. You've always acted honorably, and honor is kind of a commodity that you can trade in. You can lend your name to something, which gives it credibility. And to build a good name, you know that someone is kind and responsible, respected, honest, charitable, patient, kind, just, manages his finances well. I mean, somebody who's of good character is means that's the depth of the meaning of the word Shem. So when we dig into this commandment, I know our brothers and sisters like to dig into the pronunciation of the name, but what we need to look at first is what's the word to the left of YHVH is the Shem of Yahweh, the character of Yahweh, the character of somebody who puts up with his disobedient people for thousands of years, hoping that we will, you know, repent and enter into eternity with him and his son. His Shem is somebody who can't tolerate sin and travesties and stuff like that. And so to be the ultimate of this was Yeshua, who was sent in his Father's name. He was sent to directly represent Yahweh, and he did so in every breath that he took. And that's why we see him as the image of God. We see the complete picture of Yahweh in his Son, who had all this mercy and all this power and restraint and patience and compassion. And he was the ultimate representation of Yahweh, who came to bear our sins the way Yahweh would do so. So Yeshua is the ultimate fulfillment of this commandment. To live as Yeshua did is honoring Yahweh with every breath he took. And taking the name in vain would be to do the opposite of that. If Satan took Yeshua up on that high place and showed him all those kingdoms, and Yeshua said, you know what, I'll follow you, that would have been taking Yahweh's name in vain. So now we have to look at the word vain. Let's look to the right of Yahweh. What does vain mean? And you shall not take the Shem, the name of Yahweh your Elohim, in vain, which is Shav, for Yahweh will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain, which again, Shav. And now understand that the V sound, the V letter in Hebrew, can be a wa or a va. So it can be ya or ya. This could say sha, right? But it says shav because it's the last letter. And taking the name in vain means to bring it to emptiness, bring it to nothingness. And one way to do that would be to overtly disobey, like bringing in idols or not keeping the Sabbath. When you openly identify yourself as one of Yahweh's followers, as one of Yahweh's children, and we're baptized, we become fellow heirs according to the promise. We become brothers and sisters because we've been born again and we're grafted into the family of God. And then to continue to misbehave or to is to bring Yahweh's name down a little bit. When you identify yourself as a Christian in general, but it's a messianic in more detail, your behavior really represents your faith, which represents Yahweh. So to bring his name into nothingness, to worthlessness, is kind of what the Jewish people did when they brought in the idols over and over and over again. It's, yeah, we're God's people, but we're going to do all this other stuff too, which is openly disobeying. And those nations knew they weren't supposed to be doing those things. And so you can start to get a picture about this, in your head. So, our faith, the faith of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Yeshua, is one of action. And Christianity turned it into a conceptual academic pursuit, which is kind of the root cause of why we're so fixated on pronunciation and grammar, because sometimes you get the sense that people think that if they got the pronunciation right, that a chariot of fire would come and pick them up and take them away. Like it's some kind of magic password into the kingdom. And it's not about pronunciation at all. I can't say that, because if you pronounce it wrong, there's some wrong pronunciations of YHVH today that are actually blasphemous, that were invented by people on the internet who don't know a thing about Hebrew, which I only know like 2 things about Hebrew. But to teach falsely, particularly about the name, is a humongous problem. But the pronunciation part of it kind of takes a back seat to your behavior. I mean, imagine if you met a foreign dignitary and you butchered his name, but you did everything he wanted you to do. Would he like you? Yeah, of course, he would be enamored with you if you met the foreign dignitary and you couldn't pronounce his name and you kept butchering his name, but you were trying. But while you were trying, you were actually doing things to better his kingdom or to better his life. He would be enamored with you, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get across today. Is that being so focused on the Tetragrammaton, um, and forgetting about the words to the left and the right of the Tetragrammaton is kind of a problem. We're not to take Yahweh's name to emptiness. We are to honor Yahweh's name by doing what he said to do and not doing what he said not to do. And I want to close where I started today, which is talking about Eliezer ben Yehuda. And in the context of today's message, do you think he fulfilled the commandment to not take Yahweh's name in vain as best he could as a Jewish man living in the late 19th century, early 20th century? I believe so. I'm convinced of it, actually. I'm convinced that he lived his life to follow those commandments, to actually restore Hebrew as the language of the Jewish people, and to try to bring a Jewish state back. Now, he didn't believe in Yeshua, so that's a big giant eternal problem. But as far as the commandments, as far as what was revealed to him, I believe he kept the commandment as very, very well. He provided a restoration of the holy language, which we benefit of today. Today, I used a program called Mango Languages to start to learn how to read Hebrew, and the computer language voice has a voice because of Eliezer ben Yehuda. We're able to learn Hebrew and get closer to Yahweh and His Son because of the work of this guy, and he did a good thing. And then today we have it so good that we like to pick everything apart as if this guy who restored the language could just spend his entire life on one word, And today, being able to learn Hebrew on a computer at home, having all of these, what you see on the screen right now, having all these concordances and the ability to actually learn this stuff, Eliezer ben Yehuda gets a lot of credit for that. This blessing is a big part of our movement, which allows us to grow in the knowledge of Yahweh and His Son. And while we continue to grow, let's just continue to build on these things. It's not like this is just a 35-minute message. This isn't the most comprehensive thing you've ever heard on the name, but hopefully it gives you something to think about and some avenues to look into. I hope that you go read about Eliezer ben Yehuda and what he did, because it is a very intriguing story, a very determined guy, and understand that there's reasons why we respect those who came before us, and we're not constantly in a position of just tearing everything down and rebuilding it for ourselves. That's not even the expectation. So thank you so much for listening to this. Well, I guess it's almost a 40-minute message now. I hope you found it edifying. Please go to firstcenturychristianity.net to sign up and be part of our mailing list and distribution list for messages like this. Please send some feedback if you have any. The contact form is at firstcenturychristianity.net. And please like this wherever you are hearing it or watching it. Shabbat Shalom. May Yahweh bless you and keep you in the name of His Son, Yeshua.